Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Book, a cover-to-cover exploration of the most powerful object of our time, by Keith Houston, narrated by Dennis Kleinman. Introduction. Front matter head. Drop cap. This is a book about books. Until recently, this would have been an unambiguous statement. Whether it was a flimsy paperback or a ponderous coffee-table tome, a book was a book, and the word came without caveats. We bought books at bookshops and garage sales. We borrowed them temporarily from libraries and permanently from our friends, and sometimes the other way around. We held them reverently, gingerly, or forced them open until their spines cracked. We filed them neatly on bookshelves or piled them haphazardly at our bedsides. To borrow the words of Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart, we know a book when we see it. After more than 1,000 years as the world's most important form of written record, the book as we know it faces an unknown future. Just as paper superseded parchment, movable type put scribes out of a job, and the codex or paged book overtook the papyrus scroll, so computers and electronic books threaten the very existence of the physical book. Footnote. It is worth introducing codex as a technical term. It means specifically a paged book, as opposed to a papyrus scroll, clay tablet, or any of the myriad other forms the book has taken over the millennia. It is pronounced codex, and its plural is codices. I've used it where a distinction must be made between a paged book and any other form. E-books are cheap and convenient. Weightless things downloaded at the tap of a touchscreen or the click of a mouse and effortlessly toted around in their hundreds on a phone or tablet. Barring an actual apocalypse, your e-books will remain stored safely online forever, duplicated serenely across a host of servers in data centers around the world. It takes a strong will to resist the lure of the e-book. Yet tiny apocalypses, just not of the physical variety, are happening all the time. In 2009, in an apparent attempt to carry out the world's most ironic act of censorship, Amazon silently deleted certain editions of George Orwell's 1984 from their owners' Kindles as part of a copyright dispute, and news outlets continue to report on the plight of readers whose e-books have vanished without warning. When you click Buy Now to get the new title delivered to your account, you're not buying anything. The e-book economy is like a housing market where no one is allowed to buy a house and we, the tenants, remain trapped on the wrong side of the divide. All that set aside, pluck a physical book off your bookshelf now. Find the biggest, grandest hardback you can. Hold it in your hands, open it, and hear the rustle of paper and the crackle of glue. Smell it. Flip through the pages and feel the breeze on your face. An e-book imprisoned behind the glass of a tablet or computer screen is an inert thing by comparison. This book is not about e-books. This book is about the corporeal ones that came before them, the unrepentantly analog contraptions of paper, ink, cardboard, and glue that we have lived with and depended on for so long. It is about books that have mass and odor, that fall into your hands when you ease them out of a bookcase, and that make a thump when you put them down. It is about the quiet apex predator that won out over clay tablets, papyrus scrolls, and wax writing boards to carry our history down to us. It is, admittedly, all too easy to take the existence of physical books for granted. The sheer weight of them that surrounds us at all times in bookcases, libraries, and bookshops leads to a kind of bibliographic snowblindness. In writing this book, I leafed through hundreds more, and even then I gave many of them barely a second glance beyond the text and illustrations on their pages. But every so often I remembered to look again, and I was amazed at what I found. One book fell open to reveal a sheet of handmade papyrus glued onto a blank page. It was the first time I had ever seen or touched a piece of this ancient ancestor of paper. The plastic-seeming material covering the spine of another book turned out to be calfskin vellum, the writing material that saw off papyrus and that was in turn usurped by paper. Some books held elaborate illustrations that had been printed using wooden blocks or copper plates, or even painted by hand. In others, pasted-in color photographs printed on glossy paper were a reminder that the printing of scenes from life has not always been as convenient as it is now. A book's text can tell you something about it too, and it was a treat to come across those old books whose letters were just barely indented on the paper, the ink impressed on the page by the force of a printing press rather than wicked off an eerily flush lithographic plate. Even a humble paperback speaks volumes about bookmaking by the smell of the glue in its spine and the off-white cast of its paper. This book is about the history and the making and the bookness of all those books, the weighty, complicated, inviting artifacts that humanity has been writing, printing, and binding for more than 1,500 years. It is about the book that you know when you see it. Part 1, Part Number. The Page, Part Title. 1. Chapter Number. A Clean Sheet. The Invention of Papyrus. Chapter Title. Dropcap. Ever since Napoleon swept into Egypt at the tail end of the 18th century, ushering in the modern era of Egyptology, the outside world has thrilled to successive revelations of golden death masks and boy kings, of beautiful queens and matchless libraries, and of million-ton pyramids aligned to the points of the compass with uncanny precision. In spite of all this, ancient Egypt's most vital commodity is treated nowadays as little more than a souvenir. Papyrus, the paper-like material which the ancient world wrote its books and conducted its business, is every bit as Egyptian as the pyramids or mummies that have since eclipsed it, and it was, in its day, considerably more important than either. The intertwined stories of paper, the page, and the book begin not with the glittering wealth of god-kings or their soaring mausoleums, but with the weeds that grew abundantly along the Nile's marshy shores. Opener text. Cyperus papyrus has always been an interloper in Egypt, if a welcome one. To the south, beyond the country's borders, the banks of the White Nile and the shores of Lake Victoria, its source, are crowded by stands of papyrus sedge. Here triangular grass-like stems, crowned by sprays of fine leaves, grow from submerged roots to reach around 10 feet in height. Occasionally a clump of papyrus reeds breaks free from its moorings and drifts off downriver to lodge elsewhere along the river's banks, with some coming to rest in Egypt itself. These temporary islands were and are navigational menaces, but ancient Egypt's precious papyrus swamps could not have taken root without them. The inhabitants of the fertile Nile Delta cultivated papyrus for paper-making purposes from the 4th millennium BCE onward, though papyrus reeds were adapted to a bewildering array of other uses too. It was a veritable wonder plant. To the ancient Egyptians, papyrus was an essential part of life, and not only as a writing material. In a country that was marshy and arid by turns and conspicuously devoid of trees, papyrus reeds provided a convenient alternative to importing timber. The roots of the plant were robust enough to be carved into tools and utensils, and, in the form of charcoal, they burned hot enough to smelt iron and copper, reaching temperatures of 1,650 degrees Fahrenheit, 900 degrees Celsius. Early Egyptologists thought papyrus was also burned as a kind of incense. In 1778, a Danish classical scholar named Niels Iversen Schouw bought a papyrus scroll from a hoard alleged to have been discovered near the pyramids at Giza, whereupon the native sellers reportedly tore up and burned the rest so as to enjoy the pungent smoke. Schouw's scroll was later traced not to Giza, but instead to an oasis some miles to the south, leading the Victorian scholar F.G. Kenyon to remark sniffily that the statements of native discoverers as to the provenance of papyri are not valuable as evidence. Kenyon was a prominent member of the first wave of papyrologists, the name given to scholars who study ancient texts written on papyrus, and the tale of Schouw's misattributed scroll has since become a cautionary anecdote for students of the subject. Though it has been told and retold in many papyrological treatises, however, it turns out that burning papyrus is no more or less aromatic than burning paper. Both give off an unremarkable campfire aroma, as this author found out, rather undermining claims of its use as incense. The statements of colonial antiquarians, too, are sometimes not valuable as evidence. Papyrus stood in for wood in ancient Egyptian boat-building, especially for the simple flat-bottomed punts used for hunting and harvesting in the Nile's papyrus swamps. Dried papyrus is around 4 times more buoyant than balsa wood, and while it eventually becomes waterlogged and loses that buoyancy, a boat made from sheaves of plentiful papyrus reeds were easily replaced. But papyrus boats were prized for more than just their buoyancy. In Egyptian myth, the god Isis sailed the Nile on a papyrus boat to search for fragments of the body of Osiris, her husband, and her brother, so the story goes, and it was said that the river's crocodiles feared to attack any such craft lest they encountered a wrathful deity aboard it instead of a cowering human. Other papyrus vessels, both larger and smaller, plied the Nile alongside the simple rafts of hunters and farmers. Papyrus barges may have helped transport the colossal stone blocks used to build the pyramids, while some translations of the Old Testament say that the basket in which Moses was hidden among the reeds of the Nile shores was made from papyrus, not bulrushes. Moses may have had Isis to thank for preserving him from the Nile's ravaging crocodiles as much as he did his mother. Also, in a nautical vein, cords made from papyrus were famously strong and light. The thin green skin of the reed was peeled off in strips and plaited to make rope, while cables up to 3 inches in diameter could be woven from whole stems. Papyrus rope was so renowned, in fact, that a number of ancient writers mentioned it by name as they recounted near-mythical events of their recent history. Writing in the mid-5th century BCE, for example, the Greek historian Herodotus described how the Persian king Xerxes, preparing for an invasion of the Greek mainland, ordered the Hellespont Strait in northwest Turkey to be bridged with ropes made of Egyptian papyrus and Phoenician flax. The current proved too strong, however, and the bridge's pontoons were swept away. Displaying the sort of theatrical fury that informed his recent reinvention as a comic book villain, Xerxes ordered the waters of the Hellespont to be whipped 300 times. The straits now suitably chastised, 2 more bridges were built, successfully this time, employing 4 papyrus and 2 flaxen cables per bridge, and the invasion proceeded. The papyrus plant was also used in more domestic settings. Herodotus wrote that the Egyptians ate the lowest cubit, or 18 inches of the reed stem, and that those who wished to use papyrus at its very best roast it before eating in a red-hot oven. Modern experiments reveal that papyrus contains few calories and is meager in nutrients, though the spongy white pith may have acted as a source of dietary fiber. Aside from its dubious value as a foodstuff, papyrus was a common ingredient in medicinal preparations. Papyrus ash healed ulcers, macerated with vinegar, it treated wounds. The pressed juice relieved eye complaints, and somewhat redundantly, it was mixed with wine to cure insomnia. A patient who imbibed such a draught could sleep it off on a mattress of bundled papyrus reeds, huddled under a blanket woven from papyrus skins. Papyrus's centrality in the daily lives of Egyptians was a potent symbol of the land, its traditions, and its social strictures. Ancient Egyptians called the plant papuro, or of the pharaoh. The hieroglyphic symbol for Lower Egypt, where the Nile Delta spreads out to meet the sea, was a clump of papyrus reeds, and the sign for a single stem stood for youth, vigor, and growth. Hapi, god of the yearly flooding of the Nile, which carried essential nutrients into the fields along its banks, was depicted with papyrus growing from its head, and the leafy crown of papyrus reeds were used as decorations at religious services and funerals. Priests were forbidden from wearing sandals made of anything except papyrus, and the temples over which they presided featured columns modelled after the papyrus stem. For all this, the eponymous writing material is most enduring and widely known of all. Section break. The facts surrounding the invention of papyrus as a writing material are lost. Egyptians had been inscribing hieroglyphs on stone and pottery for some time before the arrival of papyrus, and though they were tight-lipped on the subject of writing materials, they had plenty to say about writing itself. Egyptian tradition, as recounted by the Greek philosopher Plato, told that hieroglyphics had been handed down by the ibis-headed god Thoth, and for the Egyptians and later the Greeks, Egypt's writing never lost its sacred aura. We still call ancient Egyptian writing by its Greek name of hieroglyphica, or sacred carved letters. Thamus, the mythical Egyptian king who received Thoth's gift of writing, was less reverent. Rather than thank his divine benefactor, Thamus complained that hieroglyphics would condemn humanity to absent-mindedness and amnesia. This invention will produce forgetfulness in the minds of those who learn to use it, because they will not practice their memory. Their trust in writing, produced by external characters which are no part of themselves, will discourage the use of their own memory within them. Modern-day linguists think that the idea of writing, that visual signs could be used to represent spoken words, sounds, or concepts, came to Egypt from nearby Sumer in what is now northeastern Iraq. Inspired by the Sumerian system of cuneiform writing, in which angular symbols were pressed into clay with a wedge-shaped stylus, it is thought that the earliest hieroglyphics were created by one person or a small number of people over a short period of time, thus explaining their seemingly miraculous appearance in Egypt towards the end of the 4th millennium BCE. Papyrus as a writing material, on the other hand, traces no divine origin, and more than 2 centuries of archaeological excavations have not revealed a single ancient account of its invention. It may have been inspired by woven papyrus matting, as some papyrologists have proposed, or it may not. The only thing that experts can say for sure is that it was invented around or before the end of the 4th millennium BCE. An extravagant tomb discovered in 1937 and dated to about 3000 BCE gave up a wooden box containing a blank papyrus roll. The thinking behind this particular funeral offering has not been determined. Perhaps the high-ranking official buried there planned to record his impressions of the afterlife, but scholars think that this offering was likely a book, or a representation of one at the very least. However, and whenever it was invented, papyrus joined with hieroglyphics to create a self-contained mechanism for the storage and transmission of information, a pairing that endured as the premier information technology of the ancient world, even as that world changed and expanded. Dated to around 1100 BCE, for instance, an Egyptian text called the Report of Weneman tells of a voyage to Phoenicia, the coastal region of modern Lebanon, to trade papyrus rolls for timber. The up-and-coming Greeks knew of papyrus by the 6th century BCE, and possibly earlier. Homer had mentioned papyrus rope 200 years before, in connection with Odysseus's vengeful return home to Ithaca, but he never spoke of papyrus as a writing material. Curiously, the Roman Republic, founded in 509 BCE, and whose citizens generally strove to emulate the Greeks as closely as possible, lagged somewhat. It was not until the 3rd century BCE, by which time Egypt had been invaded by Alexander the Great and colonized by his conquering generals, that the Romans are thought to have obtained a supply of papyrus from Egypt's new rulers. Thus papyrus flowed out from Egypt across the Mediterranean for thousands of years, underpinning the workings of the ancient civilization of Egypt, the proud city-states of the Greeks, and the rapacious Roman Republic. And still, in all this time, no one thought to write down precisely what this irreplaceable material was, or how it was made. Fully 3 millennia elapsed after the invention of papyrus before a Roman general saw fit to jot down a few notes about the Egyptians' ubiquitous writing material. The description of papyrus, penned in the 1st century CE by Gaius Plinius Secundus, or Pliny, was short, barely a few hundred words in length, but it is the only window we have onto the ancient craft of papyrus making. It is a source of endless contention. Born in 23 or 24 CE in the far-flung Roman province of Gaul, Gaius Plinius Secundus was a model citizen, serving as a cavalry officer, a lawyer, and later as governor of one of Rome's Spanish provinces. Later still, in 79 CE, while commanding the Roman fleet anchored at Misenum near Naples, word reached Pliny of a natural disaster unfolding almost on his doorstep. Only a few leagues away from the naval base, Mount Vesuvius had erupted. Pliny immediately took a squadron of ships across the Bay of Naples to aid the beleaguered towns of Herculaneum and Pompeii, but disaster awaited him. In a letter written many years later, Pliny's nephew explained that his brave uncle succumbed to the volcano's noxious fumes after landing on the threatened coast. Given that Pliny's companion survived, the general's asthma and obesity likely hastened his demise. As remarkable as his life had been, Pliny is best remembered for the writings he left behind. Among the many books he wrote, one work stands apart. His 37-volume Naturalis Historia, or Natural History, is one of the most important surviving records of ancient Roman knowledge and culture. The significance of natural history as a whole has never been doubted, but Pliny's writings were put under fresh scrutiny in the 20th century by an Egyptian diplomat named Dr. Hassan Ragab. Appointed as Egypt's ambassador to China in 1956, while serving there, Ragab had visited the birthplace of the revered Kleinman, the purported inventor of paper, and began to entertain the idea of resurrecting Egypt's dormant papyrus industry. But though he combed the works of Herodotus, Strabo, and other ancient historians, Pliny's was the only one that contained what he was looking for. Tucked away in its 13th volume, among stories of exotic trees and unguents, is a passage that remains the only contemporary description of how to make papyrus. Ragab's resurrection of papyrus was not to be a straightforward task, however. There are ominous clues as to Pliny's reliability, or lack thereof, scattered throughout natural history, where more sober passages are punctuated by lurid tales of cyclopses in the Carpathians, Himalayan tribes whose feet were attached back to front, and one-legged Indians who used their feet as sunshades. These serve as stark reminders of the age in which Pliny lived and wrote, and Ragab and his colleagues approached Pliny's account of papyrus-making with a healthy dose of skepticism. This was just as well, because they found themselves tied in knots almost from his first sentence on the subject. The original Latin reads as follows: Praeparator ex eo charta diviso, acu in praetenuus sed quam latissimus filares. This begins plainly enough. Pliny writes that paper, charta, is prepared by dividing with a needle, and it seems reasonable to assume that the things to be divided are papyrus reeds. The last three words, however, are more opaque. Quam latissimus relates to width, as wide as possible or as broad as possible, as two translations have it, while filire translates literally and unhelpfully as linden tree. Clearly, Pliny did not mean that reeds averaging a scant inch or two in diameter could somehow be divided to become as wide as linden trees, but what he did intend to say remains open to interpretation. The reading arrived at by Ragab and most others is that the pith of the reed must be sliced lengthwise into thin strips. One of two methods is employed. Either the triangular stem of the reed is peeled face by face, rotating it between each slice, or it is peeled top to bottom without changing its orientation. In both cases, a sharp knife is required rather than Pliny's needle, and both methods produce a series of strips of varying width. A competing interpretation proposed by Dutch papyrologist Ignace H. M. Hendricks is more unexpected. Hendricks took Pliny's mention of a needle at face value, and proposed that the triangular pith should be painstakingly unwound, not sliced, to produce a wide flat sheet with protruding ribs where the needle must change direction at the corners of the stem. As time-consuming and fiddly as this procedure sounds, microscopic comparisons of ancient papyri with modern sheets show that the ancient Egyptians may have both sliced and unwound their papyrus reeds. With détente reached as to how the reeds should be divided, the next difficulty in parsing Pliny's words lay in working out how these strips or sheets of pith should be assembled into a finished sheet of papyrus. Pliny's description of this next step is more easily translated than the first. There is no incongruous linden tree to argue over, but it is not without perplexities. Various kinds of paper, Pliny writes, are made upon a table moistened with Nile water, a liquid which, when in a muddy state, has the peculiar qualities of glue. This table being first inclined, the leaves of papyrus are laid upon it lengthwise, as long indeed as the papyrus will admit of, the jagged edges being cut off at either end, after which a cross layer is placed over it. Extract. A sheet of papyrus, in other words, comprises 2 layers of papyrus pith. The first is made by placing strips of papyrus on a table so that they abut along their long edges, and a second layer running at right angles to the first is laid atop it. Ancient scrolls readily reveal this laminated construction. Held up to the light, a cross-hatched pattern caused by the 2 perpendicular layers is easily seen. The reed's vascular bundles, which transport nutrients through the stem, stand out as dark lines against the paler parenchyma or filler cells. But what of the need for Nile water to glue the layers together? Papyrologists have detected starch between the layers of some early Egyptian papyri, a telltale sign of vegetable-based adhesives such as wheat paste, but the papyrus of Pliny's time is conspicuously free of starch. In the absence of any kind of adhesive, then, the bonding mechanism at work remains mysterious. Hassan Ragab advanced a convoluted theory that ovoid parenchyma cells, bisected by the cutting process, form dovetail joints with air pockets in the opposing strips, while botanists at Kew Gardens in London suggested that the reed's sap binds the strips together as it dries. Whatever the truth, a 2-ply sheet of papyrus pressed firmly together and left until dry will hold itself together for centuries. Nile water, muddy or not, is not required. Yet Pliny may not have been entirely incorrect. The waters of the Nile do possess a miraculous quality when applied to the papyrus-making process, though it has nothing to do with gluing layers together. Corrado Basile, a papyrologist working in Syracuse, Sicily, one of the few places outside Egypt to possess an indigenous papyrus industry, found that modern papyrus sheets were missing one particular compound found in their ancient counterparts. Aluminium sulfate, the missing compound, is abundant in Nile water, and Basile found that soaking his papyrus strips in aluminium sulfate produced whiter finished sheets. As a bonus, the clay in muddy Nile water may have helped regulate the absorption of ink, a useful property that in modern paper is managed by means of a range of additives, with none other than aluminium sulfate and clay among them. Pliny's cryptic clue about muddy Nile water has proven invaluable for modern papyrologists. The last stage of the papyrus-making process is the least controversial. Having soaked strips of papyrus pith in Nile water or a solution of aluminium sulfate, depending on one's proximity to that river, Pliny says, the leaves are pressed close together and then dried in the sun, after which they are united to one another. The end result is a thin, light sheet, perhaps 10 or 12 inches on a side, its surfaces textured by the fine lines of the reed's vascular cells. Durable, flexible, and portable, this at last is papyrus. Drop cap. Fortunately, given the sheer necessity of their existence, Pliny could write, without exaggeration, that all the usages of civilized life depend upon the employment of paper. Papyrus scrolls regularly lived productive lives of hundreds of years. The best scrolls were supple enough to be rolled and unrolled many times, provided that their readers took care not to fray their exposed edges. The books of Aristotle's library, for example, written on papyrus scrolls in the 4th century BCE, was still in use 250 years later when the Roman general Sulla spirited them from Athens to Rome. Even when a papyrus scroll reached the end.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?